Fine. Well, welcome back, everybody, to the second part of this Social Work History Network webinar, focusing on Mark Henriksen's book. And I have a feeling, Mark, I failed to say at the beginning that you are an ordained Anglican priest. Did I say that in the introduction? But we'd agreed that I would do that. But also, I know somebody who's critical of the churches as well, but you might come on to explain some of that, and perhaps you might also say to us at some point the details of the book and where people can get it. But I think we're ready to go. So, Mark, over to you for the second part of this presentation, taking a global sweep on the history and values and ethics of social work. Part 2. Mark, over to you.
Great. I'm hoping that that's come through all right. That fellow with the beard on the top left is Calvin, and you'll probably
Mark, I'm not hearing you.
No, should we try that? Let's try that.
No, I'm not hearing you.
I can hear him.
It's strange
Yeah, I can hear.
because you're not muted according to my.
I'm not muted.
I can
David.
hear.
I can hear too. David, can you hear us?
Yes, I can, and it was
Okay.
my fault, entirely my
Okay.
fault. I turned down the volume at the end of the music. Mark, my apologies, giving you a heart attack. It was my mistake. Over to you, Mark.
Great, then we'll carry on. With this second part, which the material here is shorter because I think we'll have lots more time for a robust discussion in this second part. And I'm skipping over a few years here, as I've skipped over a great deal of material, inevitably, because I'm setting out a framework for a discussion that I hope that we will have. Those of you in the UK won't know who William Beveridge is. For the rest of everyone else, he's the person that the government of the United Kingdom asked to develop a recovery plan for health and social services after World War II. In a series of reports, he outlined a plan to attack the giant social evils of want, disease, ignorance, squalor, and idleness. Isn't that interesting? He laid the foundation for the National Assistance Act in 1948, which abolished all existing poor laws. He established national health insurance. He converted the warehouse. He proposed converting the workhouses and indoor relief institutions to community clinics, hospitals, and residential care for the elderly, chronically ill, and disabled. So if you work in a rest home or a care home of any kind, you are actually working in what Beveridge set up to replace the workhouses and poor shelters. And at the 1948 Lambeth Conference, the Anglican bishops formally handed responsibility for caring for the poor back to the state for the first time since 313 CE, for the first time in nearly 1900 years. And they saw the church no longer as the primary authority responsible for caring for the poor, but the state. And it appeared at that point that de-theologizing social and health care was complete. However, public policy reforms that Beveridge proposed were expensive, and there were a series of global recessions between 1969 and 1982, which created economic insecurity. Margaret Thatcher swept into power in 1979 and remained so until 1990 on the back of that economic insecurity. She was the daughter of a Wesleyan preacher, and I argue that she maintained Calvinism in her blood till the day she drew her last breath, even though she says she converted to Anglicanism. She believed in privatization, held that self-reliance, individualism, hard work as virtue, and prosperity, but not ostentatiously displayed, were signs of the virtuous. If that sounds familiar, it's because it's all Calvin all the time. Care of the indigent was the responsibility of the family, not the state. Over-reliance on the state was constraining individual freedom, she said, and the source of economic distress. This is Calvinism in 20th century policy speak. Neoliberalism swept around the world, and at the bottom of that screen you can see all the places in the world where it became extraordinarily popular throughout North and Latin America, throughout all the British Empire, Commonwealth, residual Commonwealth, but not, it must be said, in Asia. Which I think is, or in much of Africa, except as they became colonial. While neoliberal states claimed to have greater freedoms of choice for the poor, what we see in fact is greater social control of the poor. We see greater imprisonment of poor and racial and ethnic minorities in any group defined as quote unquote deviant, and I'm using the word quite advisedly, including gender and sexual minorities. We've seen the massive growth of criminal justice budgets in the 1990s to control populations of color and indigenous peoples. For instance, and I'm not going to go through all of this, during the 1990s, African Americans were only 12% of the population, but 40% of the prison population. In the US, national expenditures for public assistance declined, but criminal justice budgets increased 540% between 1972 and 1990, and the budget for corrections alone increased 11-fold. This is all from Louis Vacant. We see the same in England and Wales, in Australia, and we see the privatization of prisons throughout much of the world, including now in Asian countries. Particularly South Korea and Thailand. In my own country, New Zealand, the number of people living in poverty grew by 35% from 1989 to 1992, but per capita income nearly doubled. Poor Latin Americans increased from 120 million in 1989 to nearly double that, 221 million. By 2002, that's 44% of the whole population. That was what neoliberalism did to poverty. It is the tragic irony of neoliberalism combined with neoconservatism that the freedom espoused by elites is grossly overbalanced by the social control of the quote-unquote deviant, who are largely defined or created by those elites. In September 2017, Jacinda Ardern, then Prime Minister of New Zealand, agreed that neoliberalism had failed. Even her opponents, her political opponents agreed. The Australian prime ministers and former prime ministers agreed that neoliberalism had run its course and its policies had led the Australian economy into a dead end. Social workers need to be aware that their clients, research participants, or beneficiaries are largely artifacts of the powerful elites who created them. We create the poor in some ways, in the same way that the church created the poor, because we need to identify our purpose. In most countries, social workers are paid either directly or indirectly through contracts by the state or third-party payers who enforce particular expectations of behaviors. This recalls Augustine of Hippo, as we talked about in the first section. For instance, in the US, the Department of Veterans Affairs is the largest, it's a federal department. It's the largest employer of social workers in the US. The top 3 industries are all paid by government. In the UK, the top employers are child welfare, schools, hospitals, all public sector jobs. In New Zealand, through the Social Worker Registration Board, the Crown educates, regulates, and disciplines all social workers in the country and employs directly or funds indirectly through contracts social workers in childcare, health and mental health, forensic settings, education, and social worker, and some social workers in government and non-governmental agencies. In all countries with title protection, the state defines what social workers can and cannot do. Social care and eligibility workers are clearly expected by public and civic authorities to enforce a set of social values and behaviors. We see this through the expectation of work as normative, or to find some training or education that will lead to work. That sounds like Calvin. Drug testing, even though the proportion of people of people on benefits who test positive through drug testing is infinitesimally small, we still insist that that's a way to prevent people from malingering or rorting the system. Workers as employees, however, are often banned from publicly challenging these state policies, and therefore we are in some ways required to participate and promulgate these policies. And yet, as social workers, our international definitions and ethics language talks about empowerment and liberation of people. And these two things sit in definite tension, reconciling the tension between enforcing statist expectations and liberating people is a key ethical challenge of social work. How do we respect diversities in places where social work organizations support government policies that significantly control these marginalized and vulnerabilized populations or punish people for being different? At what point is emancipation from poverty, empowerment, and liberation delimited by social control? I've proposed that a global future for social work must take into account an awareness of how historical theologies, and particularly Calvinism, have informed our current social work theory and practices. Otherwise, as we heard in one of the panelists say, we uncritically reproduce them. We need to consider contemporary decolonization discourses and practices not only from indigenous perspectives, well, we certainly must do that, but not only do that, but also from colonizer perspectives. I have heard social workers in colonizer nations say, we don't have indigenous people here in our country, so we don't need to think about that. To which I would respond, but you most definitely do. But you are doing that from a colonizer perspective, not from an indigenous perspective. We need to address the Western liberal humanist privilege when 70%, by a back of the envelope calculation, about 70% of the world is either Confucian, Hindu, Taoist, Buddhist, Islamic, and Ubuntu informed. Those are not worldviews, those are not epistemologies into which liberal humanism fits naturally. The question of whether social cohesion, social control, empowerment, and liberation can coexist is core to our discussions of practice and policy. We also must, I think, have the professionalization debate. I've not addressed that at all here, but I think it's important to fold in at least because, at least in passing, because how can we talk about social work as a profession when it's not even a registered recognized occupation in some extremely large countries around the world? And I think that professionalization debate is really important since this is a woman-dominated profession or woman-dominated occupation, and most of our clients are women and children. It's a debate that I think we need to have. And I am not suggesting for even one small moment that I have the answers. I see myself as the person, as one of the people, one of the many people who are raising these questions. I don't have a right to assert any particular answers because I am Western educated, English speaking, with all the privileges that attain to that. But I propose that as a discipline, social work must engage with these questions if we're going to talk about having some kind of global future. Any conversations, however, about a global future of social work and its ethics must take place with humility, open minds, and open hearts. I'm happy to provide any references from the presentation, or even better yet, read the book. Or get the book if you wish, but you can also email me directly and I'll be happy to provide any resources that you might be looking for. And now I will be quiet.
Thank you very much, Mark, for throwing down that challenge and the opening up those big questions, which I think any of us who are involved in social work, whether in practice or in policy, grapple with those issues. So we've got a bit of time for some discussion and conversation, starting off again with our panel. And with the ethical questions, obviously coming to Sarah makes sense to open up the conversation. So Sarah, your reflections. You've written so much about these issues and these struggles, but your reflections onto the challenge which Mark has thrown down.
Thank you very much, Mark. And David, I don't think it's a challenge, it's multiple challenges, isn't it, Mark? And like Mark, I don't have any answers, but the questions are really important, and the framing of the questions, and to keep restating the questions in each new era and new set of circumstances, I think, because in some ways the questions, the challenges are the perennial ones, aren't they? The social control issue has been there throughout history, but it's very, very important to get that long perspective and look at how it's changed over time, but then to place ourselves now in this current world and ask the questions again, but in different words, in a different context. So I was drawn to, I don't know why, the third bullet point on the penultimate slide, which was the question of whether social cohesion, social control, empowerment and liberation can coexist as goals of our practice and policy. And I guess your talk has shown that they do coexist, but the big question is, do they coexist comfortably or without contradiction? And the answer is most certainly no. And thank goodness, because in some ways we need that discomfort, and we need to re-feel that discomfort again and again, don't we, to understand what it is about what we're saying we're doing as social workers, and what the profession globally says about itself, and how that meshes with the practice and the realities of the modern world. So you've shown that they do coexist, but they don't coexist comfortably. So the big question is, how do we handle those contradictions? And maybe they don't all exist as goals shared by all the stakeholders or participants, the politicians, the practitioners. What about the social workers? As Marcus has indicated, the global definition actually doesn't use the word social control. It talks about social cohesion and the empowerment and liberation of people. And at the start, it talks about social change and development. So where Mark's got social control, the global definition has got social change and development. Not surprisingly, social workers are not going to set themselves up as social controllers. And to be honest, probably many politicians wouldn't, although many actually do, because that is what they want to show that they're doing, controlling and containing the people who are regarded as poor, marginal, migrants, outsiders. So is it disingenuous of the social work profession and us as social workers, as it were, to miss out the social control function from our key definitions and from our statement of ethical principles? I think we're all aware of the control and the state aegis that we all work within, but does it need to be there in the ethical principles and values, or at least a bigger acknowledgement? I think Mark's right to suggest it does, not as something that we want as a goal, but as something that we need to challenge and critique and be wary of. It reminded me of philosopher Alistair MacIntyre, who talks about practices, and I think social work could be regarded as a practice, having external goods and internal goods. And the internal goods are those that are about excellence and what makes that practice a good practice, promoting human flourishing. And the external goods are those which are the goods of excellence, and that may be institutionally focused goods. So it may not be surprising that social workers are not focusing on the external goods which the institutions and the governments, the states that they're working within are promoting. But I think Mark's question particularly highlights that axis in social work, from domestication to liberation, to use Paulo Freire's terms, which is a perennial challenge among the many other axes that we have in social work. And I think it stresses the importance of ethical vigilance in social work. During the pandemic, as David knows, we did some work with the IFSW on the ethical challenges. And one of the key issues that came up was the importance of ethical vigilance in a time when what used to be right is now wrong, and vice versa, looking at the world with new eyes, because what worked in the past was no longer working and was no longer right. So that idea of vigilance and really looking closely, carefully, being constantly on the ball, being critical, I think is very, very important. Looking out for where we may be contributing to the domestication rather than the liberation of people, knowing that the liberation is an ideal, an aspiration, but something that we need to work towards. And like some of you in the room, probably, I was at the European Conference for Social Work Research last week in Vilnius, which was on the theme of social work in the age of Industry 4.0. So looking at the implications of the Internet of Things, the connected devices, the control over industrial production, but also AI, algorithms, care bots, digitalization in social work. And of course, that has huge ethical implications. And that strikes me in looking to the future of in what ways is social work going to be implicated in the surveillance that comes with some of those digital methods, with the dehumanization of the social work role and relationship, and what we can do as social workers to put that on the agenda, to take it seriously and to challenge that shift towards perhaps surveillance and domestication. And there were many interesting and challenging talks, including the use of algorithms in doing mental capacity assessments, the use of algorithms in making ethical decisions. But one that particularly struck me, which is at the micro level of practice, was from, I think it was from Sweden, where some researchers had been doing work on conversation analysis, looking at the introduction of robot pets into care homes, so little dogs and cats that were robots. And the conversation that the care workers were having with the people in the care homes, some of whom had dementia, and they'd been trained to be, quote, transparent, that is, not to pretend there was a real cat or dog, but inevitably in the conversations with the people they were introducing the pets to, they didn't have the heart to keep saying, well, no, it's not a real dog, not a real cat. This is a micro issue about pleasure versus distraction, the distraction of the bots. Are the care workers going to be leaving the residents, stroking the care bots? The fear of, as Frederick Reamer talks about it, client abandonment in his terms, abandoning the people we should be working with face to face through digitalization, algorithms, etc. So those are just some of my thoughts, because Mark had put future and future ethical issues, so I can see a whole load just coming in that area. And I'll leave it to my colleagues Linda and Prosper, who I know are going to talk more about decolonization, oppression, racism, etc., which are other very important key issues. So thank you, Mark, for giving such a stimulating and wide-ranging overview.
And thanks, Sarah. And it's so just thinking these things actually have a very practical and immediate application in practice sometimes. I remember once in early my child protection work, working with a voluntary agency that was particularly strongly supporting a woman who'd suffered domestic violence. And then she abused the child, and the swing from support to anger and rejection, almost, because this person hadn't been behaved consistently with the expectation. And it felt to me that was a lack of integration of these different roles, these different functions that we have, and an understanding of what that means for your practice and your relationship with people. That had a huge impact on that particular family, that lack of integration of that ethical thinking and understanding of role. But Prospera, over to you for some reflections.
Okay, thank you. And I was just thinking similar things to what Sarah was sharing there, but I want to come at this point from this question about how I think I'll just read it out, Mark. What you said was, how do we respect diversities in places where social work organizations support government policies that severely control or punish people for being different? And I'm coming at this from an educator perspective and wondering and just reflecting on just how difficult it is actually to articulate that within the confines of a classroom, whether that be through just conversations with students or through their assessments, but more importantly, when they're out on placement, learning to do the job. And then perhaps then when they're qualified and working. And we often have practitioners come back and say to us, oh, you know, stuff that you guys teach is classroom based only. It doesn't work in practice. It doesn't look like this in practice. And we're constantly, certainly I'm constantly looking for ways in which or ways to deliver these kinds of ideas and thoughts that enable our newly qualified and our existing practitioners to think about these contexts more, you know, in a more measured way. So I'm not sure I have the answers either, but what I will say in respect of that particular element is that we keep coming back to what are our main values as social workers, what are the ethics we signed up to, but again, like what you've said, Mark, coming back to the fact that we are regulated. If we are a regulated profession in the countries that we're teaching and working in, then we are constrained by what we are expected to talk about and not talk about. And a very recent case in point, an ongoing case in point, you'll notice from the global or some of the areas where we have violence at the moment, people feel quite constrained about what they can say and can't say as social workers. And we have incidents where people are challenged for expressing a view about what's happening globally in parts of the world in terms of conflict and violence and so on. So I really do see this as an ongoing conversation, but importantly, from where I'm sitting, I'm beginning to think about how do we, certainly the aim of my research has always been around how do we prepare practitioners to work across diverse populations. And so these questions that you posed today, looking at an ethical global future, for me are really important, and also recognizing that practitioners don't always train and remain in the countries where they train, that they move around. In that regard, I'm one of those. And so how are we able to move around with or relocate ourselves to different places with the very basic understanding for respecting diversities and respecting difference. So I think that for me, that's come across quite strongly today from your talk, and thinking about how history has helped us move along that path. And just very quickly then, before I end, is again looking at the statistics that you talked about, where particular racialized groups seem to be the minority in terms of in terms of numbers or statistics, but are overrepresented in particular forms of criminal and or prison populations, children looked after, and so on and so forth. And again, for me, that all comes back down to what we are, not just what we are taught, but how we are almost programmed to practice upon qualification without risking, what people say, without risking their livelihoods. And so I think there's a lot there that I'm taking away, and hoping that people who are in the audience today can shed some light on that as well. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Prospera. And we put a link to Mark's book in the chat, and also the website for the History Network if you want to sign up and keep in touch with us. And Linda, I know you dropped out at some point, but do you? I'm not sure if you've come back, but are you able to join us and some thoughts?
Yes, yes.
Great.
Thanks. I've been back for quite a while.
Good.
And having looked at Mark's presentation before, luckily I didn't miss too much. Thanks again. And just maybe quite briefly, I also would like to focus on one thing that Mark said, and I'm also like Prosper going to just read this out. Mark proposes that the global future for social work must take into account certain important issues like what is presented, the awareness of how these the historical theologies have informed our work. But Mark, you mentioned contemporary decolonization discourses. You mentioned needing to address Western liberal humanist privilege. And then you ask if social work isn't called or recognized as a sorry, I've just had a strange message come up about my speaking language. Must be my South African accent. If it isn't recognized or even called social work in some contexts, how can we refer to a global profession? I think the trend recently in Global Social Work Day and the adoption of the themes that we've had say quite a lot about what's going on in social work discourse, around Ubuntu and the recent one, Buen Viver. And something that I think is so important that we need to consider is that there's so many different philosophical traditions out there. And when I say we, I speak of myself as a South African social work academic, but having worked in Scotland for 7 years and spent a little bit of time grappling with what those differences seem to be, how we create a global social work that genuinely is global, because the dominance of the Western Eurocentric side of social work is dealt with to the extent that it's not universalized, so that it's not seen as the universal and everything else is indigenous. I don't think that social workers in a Western context should have to consider whether there are people of descriptions and categories that they think might need a kind of social work that fits for them. I think Western social work desperately needs the Ubuntus and the Buen Vivers and the Buddhist social work and all of these traditions. And then each context can examine what fits for them and what they need to leave and what they need to embrace. But what worries me is how some of these might be appropriated, and the really essentially important, huge messages, some of them are just silenced and invisibilized. For example, Buen Viver, it's quite hard to pronounce, I may be saying it incorrectly, is profoundly anti-capitalist, is very critical of Western development theory. And yet, if you read what we were celebrating, it was a much more romanticized, in harmony and interconnectedness, and of course, all the important aspects, but the very serious consideration of structural issues and social injustice do not get foregrounded as much. And so there might be quite a lot of discomfort around other traditions or traditions that come from other contexts. But unless we actually look at what they say and we search actively for those different traditions, global social work will remain, I think, a Western Eurocentric imposed profession. And then on top of everything comes the concerns around poverty and global inequality and what capitalism does structurally to all of us, regardless of our backgrounds and philosophies.
And there was a comment in the chat, Linda, about the risk of indigenous ideas and philosophies being stolen or co-opted or abused. I mean, in a sense, that is the risk of all discussion and reflection, that ideas get taken and adapted and changed and moved. But there are those risks. Do you have any thoughts on that?
You know, I think the issue of power is so important because it is the powerful who seem to have that capability of doing the taking and appropriation. And so I think also there needs to be a lot of reflection about who holds the power and what is the white normative and sometimes white supremacist positions. Globally, you know, the issue of ongoing colonialities, I think, is a really important issue. And so it's going to take a lot of work in us, and I speak of myself as a white South African, and it's not about a performative statement about what that means, but certainly it does mean having privilege and power, even in my own context. And unless there's a very careful dealing with that and awareness, consciousness of that, and a stepping away when necessary, I don't think it can be dealt with adequately.
And there's been a long-standing sort of perception that social work is somehow a middle-class imposition on working-class communities in Western, in northern cultures, a form of colonialism, and some of the removing children from the families of the poor to give them to the families of the better off in terms of adoption can be seen in that sort of context. So it's multi-layered, and it needs constant reflection. Do you want to come back, Sarah or Prospero, on any of that?
Let's take some of the questions in the chat, maybe.
Mike Burt was raising something, and Mike's done a lot of work on roles. And I wonder, Mike, if you're there, whether you want to pick up the points you made.
Yes, thank you. I'm not sure I can get the video working.
We can hear you clearly. Go ahead.
If social work is to have a global future, and more importantly, a global influence, it seems to me that there's a case for making more of a specific difference between what we mean by social work and social care. I have read Mark's book, and he tends, I think, to use social care in the distant past up until the 20th century, and he tends to use social work from the 20th century onwards. But in fact, social care has increased significantly itself in the last 100 years. So I think there's a point there. I also wonder whether what social workers actually do, which is to involve themselves in people's care networks, has more of an association with social work in other parts of the world than perhaps we give it credit for. It isn't all about just working with individuals in Western culture. It's about working within their care networks.
Mark, do you want to come back on that?
Yeah, just briefly, and I concur with you. I concur with your observation. I think the reason that I do that is because social work is a more coherent discipline that has organizations around it, has statements, has definitions, has codes of ethics, and so forth. Whereas social care is a very wide and less, for at least as I'm aware, less clearly defined and less structured area, and would be very difficult to track down. So that and the audience, the target audience, is social workers. And as you say, I don't use the term social work before Bosanquet uses the term, or in the early 20th century. So that's the rationale behind that.
We're coming to the last minutes of the webinar. there was a question from Jen about carceral social work, which I have to say is a phrase I haven't heard before. Does anybody wish to comment on that? Or Jen, if you're there, very quickly to explain that point.
Yes, thank you for taking my question. I'm Jen Petzen. I'm working in Germany, but reading things from abolitionist social workers in North America and Canada, also people from the Indigenous community who are looking at social work in the fields of healthcare, psychiatry, childcare, schools, and of course in the area of migration, and looking at how it feeds into a carceral system of control of communities, poor people and people of color, Indigenous people who have been traditionally marginalized and criminalized in North America and settler colonialist societies. And I was just wondering if anyone wants to pick up that thread or tie it into what we've been listening today.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Jen. Mark, do you want to come in on that point? No,
Not especially.
anybody?
Well, yeah,
Sarah.
I think it's a really important movement, and particularly the abolitionist movement coming from North America, which we all need to look at, because it's not just about the imprisonment, is it? It's about all the punitive approaches that social work is complicit in. So I do think that's an important idea, and it brings it into our consciousness by using this term carceral, the carceral state or carceral social work. It's really bringing us up short and saying, yes, we are part of this imprisoning, this hiding, this fencing around people. So yeah, thanks for raising that point, Jen.
Thank you. And Paul Dolan had a comment on Calvin in the 20th century. Paul, do you want to quickly come in on that point?
I think it's an entirely new discussion, but it's a recognition of the variety of sources that we might look to.
Yes. Thanks, Paul. There's diversity. And it just occurred to me, Mark, that there's another Christian tradition of seeing all people as children of God and equally to be respected and to be valued. And that's another whole theological line. But perhaps come back to Mark. Do you want to draw this all together?
I don't think I can.
No.
I guess the goal in all of this is to invite people to do some thinking, and to do some reflection, and to do some consideration about some critical thinking about how we got to where we are. Because only by knowing how we got to the present can we begin to make deliberate, thoughtful decisions about where we're going next. And I think social work is at a critical moment in its development as a discipline. And this is the time for us to begin to critically to consider all of this. So I'm very grateful for the questions that have been raised, for the discussion, particularly the panelists who have done so much thoughtful responding here, but also from everyone else who both in the chat and verbally. I'm very grateful that we're doing the thinking. Where we go next is very exciting. I don't know where that is, but I'm really excited about it.
Certainly, I was at the World Conference in Panama 2 or 3 weeks ago. 1,500 people, roughly, large majority from Latin America, very enthusiastic, and with a chef in the schools of social work and in the Federation of Social Workers. Both their presidents now are in Africa. So there are all sorts of interesting developments and challenges. I'd like to come back to the panelists, but I don't think we're going to have time unless anybody wishes to wave. I see Sarah shaking her head. So But so it's down to me at exactly 10:15 to say a huge thanks to everybody, and the comments in the chat are reflecting the fact that this has been really stimulating. It's opened many questions, and the questions are there to be explored. And if social work is to be confident in the future, it has to address these questions and can continue to be seen to be addressing them and taking the lead in raising them. One or two comments came about the Commonwealth Organisation for Social Work. Our membership register has been closed whilst we've been doing some constitutional reorganisation, but the associate membership register will be opening, I hope, this week. That's for individuals and members. It's free to join up. That's a network, and we are certainly interested in exploring with the Institute of Commonwealth Studies the history of social work across the Commonwealth and having partners to do that. But that's an evolving process. As far as the Social Work History Network is concerned, as you saw on the screen earlier, our next event is on the 17th of June, 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the usual time for our UK-based webinars, and that's going to look at social work and neglect 1948 until today, from the cruelty man and problem families via prevention to safeguarding. So there will be a sweep of June Thoburn, Michael Lambert and Marion Brandon will be talking, and again, you can sign up for that on our website. I don't think there is anything else that I have to say, except huge thanks to Mark for the book and for doing the preparations. A massive exercise of research and reflection, which is really stimulating and raises so many questions, particularly about the diversity of social work and its global presence and what that actually means. To Sarah in Durham, to Linda in Pretoria, and to Prospera in Dublin, it's great that our technology has connected us in this relaxed and informal way. And to all of you for taking part and your comments. We've had over 100 people most of the time online. So thank you very much. Enjoy your day and keep thinking about these important questions, which are really about the nature of human relationships and how, as a world, we need to live. And in these hugely dangerous and risky times, everybody needs to be thinking about that and taking steps to preserve life on Earth, really. So let us engage in that conversation. Thank you for your commitment, and enjoy the rest of the day or the evening, wherever you are. From the Social Work History Network, goodbye.